particularly in controversial matters, you sometimes run into situations where the bibliography is all from the same author or from the same group of authors. This is true, for instance, in alternative medicine, where the general scientific journals do not accept articles by homeopaths. And so the homeopaths write in their own literature, and their citations are from each other. So that's one kind of problem you have dealing with. How do you make any kind of decision when there isn't really a way of checking alternative views against each other? Another criterion is what kind of evidence is offered.
It's not working.
Oh. Do you want to sit up front?
I'm fine.
You okay? So you can ask. For instance, sometimes there is evidence which is not directly related to the topic at hand, and you might think that therefore it's more neutral as far as the differences of opinion that are involved. This would be true, for instance, anthropological papers that could be cited in the discussion of Angus and Hardin, but were not directly written for those purposes. If this were a long paper, then you might consider the question, can you track down the evidence? When a claim is made, very often that claim is backed up by another citation. So then you can try to track that citation, and one of the things you can ask is the author of a paper using legitimately the citations that are given? It's sometimes the case that you'll find that papers misuse the evidence. They'll quote a paper in a way that doesn't appear in the original. So these are some of the ways in which you can start orienting yourself when there are discrepancies. Another might be the question of where do the opinions come from? Now this is a little more difficult to deal with because the bias of an author is not by itself evidence that what the author is proposing is wrong. So you have to start considering what is the nature of the bias in the writing of a paper. Have you encountered any of that in your reading? Any obvious biases? Well, one obvious one that the New England Journal of Medicine has discovered is who finances the research. And we see that a large fraction of the papers that support a particular course of therapy was sponsored by the company that markets that therapy. All right, so that has made the editors of the scientific journals a lot more cautious, and we have rules now for conflict of interest. So now, what would constitute a conflict of interest?
Well, I think having a company that's, say, sponsoring a drug, or where they have a secondary gain from finding the information that they find. Mm-hmm. And so if it's a drug company that's sponsoring it and finding that the drug works, they benefit from that fact. But the problem is it's tough to kind of separate out those motivations, because people say that people in research do that to do their career further versus, pharmaceutical industries do it to further their money. So it's kind of tough to separate people. They're doing it for a certain reason, and they almost all benefit from finding something.
Yes. It was discovered that sometimes research is simply not published. The research contract sometimes gives the sponsor a certain amount of control, at least first choice in the publication. So that's one way in which research might be biased.
And just to follow up on that, no one ever publishes negative results. Just in general, been part of a couple studies where the technique didn't work in a certain setting, and we didn't even try to submit it to a journal because we knew A, no one would take it, and B, it would tarnish the reputation of the primary investigator. So,
Yes. So there's still a bias against negative results. And yet in controversial issues, negative results could be very important. A paper that says there's no statistical difference between treatment A and treatment B. That would be an important finding, particularly when the proposal is that treatment A replace treatment B. But you're right that those papers are much less likely to appear. You're not going to get a degree easily out of that. So it's not good. It's not good for careers. Then you have to consider why was certain research done and not other research. And the major answer to that is that because this research, at least potentially, is leading to a marketable product. Now these are the kinds of things that we could talk about as highly specific research bias. There are other more subtle kinds of research bias in, for instance, the statistical techniques that are used, the design of an experiment. Look at the size of the sample. In what way was the sample representative? And there are some of the obvious things that we check for, like the age distribution, gender. Sometimes ethnicity is relevant, particularly if it operates by way of diet or other customs. So there's the question of the choice of sample. Then there's how long is the study carried out? Now the pressure is to have a study short enough so you get publishable results within a reasonable length of time. So you have to ask the question, was it long enough to really be able to detect the effect that you're concerned with? All of these can fit into the category of idiosyncratic research. That is the biases that are located in the individual investigator or the research contract. Lately, universities and journals have been pretty much aware of these kinds of biases. There are technical biases, and this might be in the choice of statistical tests. Then you have to examine why is one test chosen over another, or why might a whole series of tests be chosen? And if different tests give different results, what criteria might you use for choosing among them? There is a whole other class of bias, which I'm referring to as generic bias. These are biases where the investigator has no direct personal gain from the research, but nevertheless is biased toward doing work in a particular direction. One reason for this is that some kinds of research are more popular than others. So a study on the response of some animals to particular chemical treatments or toxins might be more attractive than a study on the lifespan of mice, where it's influenced by weather, by predators, by population size. So you have to ask, how publishable is a result, and what will this do in relation to the career of the investigators? Sometimes you get straightforward lie-in. There have been a number of such cases. They tend to become more common now when there's a greater urgency to publish, to finish, to get a job. And so there have been cases of scientific fraud, and usually what happens there is that data is falsified, and the researcher justifies it by saying, well, nobody's going to read this paper anyway. What does anybody care? So we have a whole class of scientific fraud. But in particular, what I would like to deal with is generic conflict of interest. And these are intellectual biases. For instance, the dominant philosophy of science since the 17th century has been reductionist. And reductionism is the belief that if you understand the smallest pieces of something, you've basically understood it. The question, what is this, becomes turned into the question, what is it made of? So it's one kind of reductionist bias. Another is the belief that if you've taken something apart, the smallest elements are the most fundamental. And you hear that kind of language quite often. This applies to the discussion of causation in disease. When you might, there was one famous paper of the 1970s which asked, does tuberculosis kill workers, or does working kill tuberculotics? Are people more vulnerable to diseases because of their position in society? Or is the position in society simply a vulnerability factor for a disease? So you can ask the question, is the cause of the disease a microorganism? Or is the cause of disease the ecology of the population? The nutritional state, the density of residents? It could be a whole list of factors that influence the vulnerability to disease of people in different social locations. So this is a distinction between a reductionist and a holistic view of the problem of disease. And the choice between them is usually made without thinking very much about it. One place where you do think about it is in applying for grants. There's a bias in the granting structure in favor of reductionist research, the study of the very small. Study of particular treatments, and so on. In agriculture, the equivalent is the question, do you control pests by spraying them or by releasing praying mantises? Do you reduce exposure to disease by mixing crops of different kinds? Or by trying to isolate the field? Or by trying to prevent the pest from getting in? One very important strategy is plant quarantine. The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, reports several thousand introductions of alien species at the major ports and airports of the United States. This is every year. Some of this will be insects that hide out in ornamentals. One major source of disease is the exotic pet trade. Birds in particular from Latin America will come in and they'll bring their own viruses. Migration becomes an important element in the introduction of disease. So one of the questions is to ask, where did people come from? and what were the conditions under which they came. So right now, at the present time, the government of Haiti is suing the United Nations for the introduction of cholera through its Nepalese security troops. So these are all elements which create a bias in research. There are the biases of peasants, that is their own system of beliefs as to what gives you a good crop. And this is different from the biases of agricultural corporations. So the study of bias becomes an important element when you're trying to resolve controversies in science. And we have to become increasingly sophisticated in the understanding of what constitutes a bias. So biases can coexist with a subjective commitment to truth. And one of the problems we then have is, how do you ferret out the biases in the work of people who, for all intents and purposes, are trying to be honest, who are trying to check out their results, and so on. There are also the career kinds of biases, where different laboratories will be in competition simply to get credit for something. And the credit then turns into access to things like Nobel Prizes. So there's the famous controversy about the organism responsible for HIV with Gallo, and I don't remember who the competitor was now, but a US and a French laboratory were in competition, and when they're in competition, they sometimes say nasty things about each other. In earlier times, you had competition between museums, particularly when prehistoric reptiles were being discovered. There was the famous case of a holdup, where I think it was a gang from Harvard that stole some specimens from the American Museum of Natural History. So all of this is by way of saying that what's published is not necessarily true, that there can be biases in scientific reports, and then your problem becomes, how do you evaluate the bias? Now, one way is the kind of democratic one of asking how many papers agree. And in one way or another, you get into the area of meta-analysis. In meta-analysis, you review a large number of papers on the same topic. Then you throw away some because you can say, ha, this couldn't be. We use the category outlier to discard data which we think is so way out that it couldn't possibly be true. Then from what remains of the meta-analysis, you tabulate, and you say that 15 papers say yes and only 5 say no. So therefore we'll go with the 15, and we'll decide that the conclusion is correct. You might review it a little more closely and ask what kind of biases might have been present in the sampling, in sponsorship, in other ways. But in all of this, it's important to consider that what you read is not necessarily true. And therefore you have to start figuring out, how are you going to judge whether something is more credible or not? Now, credible doesn't quite mean true, because we know that scientific claims of one period can be discarded in another period. So one of the things I have now is one student, one research assistant, working on the problem of the half-life of a theory and the half-life of a pharmaceutical. By the half-life, we mean the time that it takes for half of these drugs to be removed from the market. And the removal is either a result of something better coming along or something simply not being fashionable. You'll sometimes hear medical school lectures. Well, in the 19th century we used to do X, but nowadays we realize. And there'll be classic examples. Since I happened to meet a descendant of the doctor who killed George Washington, and he did it by large application of leeches. Leeches were considered a way of getting rid of bad blood. And so it could produce anemia, it could undermine the immune system, and it could result in early mortality. Okay, so I'd like you to think about this when you do your papers. Consider what's believable, what's reliable, what is in doubt, or very often, how would you make a decision between opposing theories? Now, this is particularly important in student papers, where the amount of study that you do, or the amount of field experience that you have in one summer, is not enough to reach a decision between alternatives, but it is enough to say, this is the question and this is the way I think we could find out. So there always ought to be this element of skepticism in scientific work. Is the argument reasonable? Is the evidence convincing? Is there counter-evidence that's used honestly? These are all elements in trying to make decisions between alternative theories. And so perhaps, if we have time for it, next week we'll come back to the Harden-Angus discussion and see what your thinking is, how you decide among alternative viewpoints. And now I want to switch gears and go over to agriculture. Agriculture is one of the major modes of existence of the human species. It's a relatively young mode of existence. It's one of the forms of production. So I take a little detour and refer to production. Production is a process whereby the unusable is turned into the usable. Now, in a certain way, all organisms engage in production. Digestion is a process of production in which inedible substances are turned into edible substances. When you take alien proteins that are not usable in the body, you can break them down into amino acids that then can be used to construct proteins which are usable. So, all animals, in a certain way, engage in production. But of course, for people, it's a very special kind of production. We tend to divide animals into detritivores that feed on decaying matter, herbivores that feed on vegetable matter, carnivores. We might divide it a little more subtly. There are the insectivores. In the ocean, the distinction between vegetable and animal prey is not as clear-cut because we have filter feeders. Filter feeders can be tiny crustaceans or they can be giant whales. What they do is plow through the water, filtering the water and extracting from it what's usable. But when you filter the water, you really don't distinguish very much between algae and protozoans. What you're interested in is things the right size. So now we can ask the question, what kind of vor are we? Well, for one thing, we might be described as omnivores. We eat both animal and vegetable matter. And there are some other groups of animals that do this. For instance, bears are omnivores. Bears belong to the family of carnivores, with dogs and the big cats and so on. But within that family, the bears have the broadest diet. They'll eat animal and vegetable matter. And with the animal matter, they'll eat terrestrial and aquatic animals. So the question is, are we omnivores? Or might we introduce another term, productivores? Rather than capturing vegetables or animals, what we might do is produce our own food by transforming materials acquired in the environment. Now these two terms, omnivore and productivore, are both in a way true and would be used in different ways. If you use the term omnivore, you're stressing the fact that you're eating a lot of different things, and therefore you have to be able to digest them, and you have to be able to catch them. When you talk about productivores, you say you gather a lot of very diverse materials that are not usable, and you do something to them. And the something that we do to them to make things edible includes drying, salting, smoking, storing away. And this will be different. There are other animals that do some of this. Spiders store their food. There are solitary bees, which will capture an insect larva and put it into an egg cell along with an egg. So they're taking something which wasn't edible, running around. They make it edible by killing it and sticking it into a cell where the offspring can develop. So when we introduce a term for the discussion of a scientific problem, it's useful to ask why, and ask, what insights do you get from using the term omnivore? What insights do you get from using the term productivore? And again, it's not a question of one being true and the other false, but of each giving you different kinds of insights. Now, our species has been around for maybe 1 or 2 million years. And I'm using the species in a broad sense. Lately, there's been a lot of work on the hominids. And these are our closest relatives, the family within the primates, the subgroup among the primates that are most similar to us. The famous fossil Lucy is a hominid, even though she's not in the genus Homo. She's generally assigned to Australopithecus, the southern ape. There are species within the genus Homo, like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo robustus, and their fossils have been found very widespread in the world. When I was a student, we were taught about Java man and China man. And both of these turn out to belong to the genus Homo, but a different species, Homo erectus. They had relatively large brains. They had hands that could manipulate their environment. Some of them were able to make primitive tools, pebble tools. They used fire. They had cultural attributes such as the burial of the dead. Then, within the genus Homo, there's Homo neanderthalis, Homo florensis is a newly discovered identified species on the island of Flores in Indonesia. They basically look human, but they're about 4 feet tall, and they coexisted on this island